everyone, in this video I'm going to go over a few more things that we can do with disjunctions, namely De Morgan's law, material implication, and conjunctive conditionality. Let's get into it. So now I'm going to start talking about three rules that are very similar. We're going to talk about De Morgan's law, and then things that can be derived from De Morgan's law, namely the rule for material implication, and then also conjunctive conditionality. And they're actually versions of the same move. They're all predicated on De Morgan's law. Like, if De Morgan's law is true, these also work as kind of shortcuts. The abbreviations for these, for De Morgan's law, is going to be DM. For material implication, it's going to be MI. And then for conjunctive conditionality, it's going to be CC. I'll talk about this one first. Before I get to that, I want to talk about the notion of negations. So these all are predicated on negations and knowing where they could go. We've talked about this a little bit before when it comes to negations, but let's talk about it this way. In any dyadic proposition, that is a statement where it's got two parts, there are three places we could stick a negation slot. So whether I've got an arrow, a double arrow, a dot, a wedge, or an XOR. If I said like A, any of these B, A arrow B, A if and only if B, A and B, A or B, A or B, but not both. In any one of these situations, there are three places that I could put a negation. Now they all change the meaning. So what I mean by that is, for example, a negation is not going to go like under the B. That's not a thing that we do. Okay, or it's not going to go over the whole thing. That's not a thing that we do. Where are the places they could go? There's three slots. So, and I'm going to label these this. They could go on the outside, the left, and the right. Now, the latter two are more obvious. So here's a place where we could stick a negation. We could stick one on the right. So I'm going to call this the right negation slot. So we could stick a squiggle on the right. We could stick a squiggle on the left. Not that we have to, just that we could. And there's one other place that we could put a negation. So again, not out here, that's not a thing. Where's the other place where we could stick one? Well, if we have these in parentheses, we could also stick one on the outside. So that's why this would be called the outside. But we had that before, like when I said like it's impossible for both, or we can't have both. What does that look like? A dot B with a squiggle on the outside. So here, the outside negation is activated, neither the left nor the right, but the outside one is. But if I had something like not A, arrow B, here the left one's activated. But if I said something like A or squiggle B, here just the right one is activated. So this is the first thing we need to know, that these are the possible negation slots, the outside, left, and right. And of course, if we had a more complex proposition, we could zoom into its sides, and then those could have their own respective outside, lefts, and rights. So what I mean by that, for example, is if I had something like A dot B, arrow, A, wedge, C. For the whole thing, this would be the left, this would be the right, and this would be the outside. But then if I just zoomed in, on the other hand, to this part, in this part, for this part, this is the outside, this would be the left, and this would be the right for this part. So this is what I want you to know before we go on to these rules, just that there are three possible places for negation slots, outside, left, and right, depending on what level you're looking in. Now knowing this, let's see what De Morgan's law looks like. De Morgan's law is a rule that allows us to switch between a wedge and a dot and vice versa. So actually any and statement is also an or statement and vice versa. Let me show you what I mean by this. So let's say I had A dot B, and I said you can't have both of these. What De Morgan's law allows us to do is you can go between an and a wedge, or a dot and a wedge, and you can go between a wedge and a dot simply by doing this. Change the symbol, obviously, from one to the other, and then you flip all three negation slots, the outside, the left, and the right. That's it. So you can turn any and into an or statement. So for example, this as it is says you can't have both A and B. We can change it. So let's say this was our assumption here. You can change it into an or by doing the following. Keep the letters, so bring the letters down. Those aren't going to change. Change the symbol, so you can change it from a dot to a wedge, and then all you do is flip the negation slots. So I think of this almost as like, if you've ever been in like a room where you have like three light switches, especially if you have one where like outside the room, the light switch is on, but then in the other room the light switch is off, and then you can kind of flip them and figure out like, well, what turns the fan on? It's that kind of situation. Okay, what light switches you have on and so forth. Very similar situation. So what we do here is actually just change the slots. So here the outside negation slot is on, so we're going to turn it off. Here, the negation slot is off. We're going to turn it on. Here, the negation slot is off. We're going to turn it on. And so what that means is, and I can say here we did this De Morgan's law line 1. saying this, you can't have both A and B, is the same thing as saying, now, we haven't really talked about this yet with, you remember, or is either or. This says neither A nor B, which is the same thing as saying not A or not B. These things are equivalent. Saying you can't have both is the same thing as saying you can neither have this nor that. Or another way to say it, you can't have this one or you can't have this one. And it's inclusive, which is kind of weird. But still, this is how De Morgan's law works. So you can take any or statement and turn it into a and statement, or any and statement and turn it into an or statement, and vice versa. You can't use XORs here. Only inclusive disjunctions. Okay, so De Morgan's law, there's no XORs are not a factor here. There's some stuff that we can do with them. I'm going to talk about that later. So for any of these, it works. So if I had A wedge B, you can have this thing, or you can have this thing, maybe both. We can turn that into an and statement. So what do? Drop down the letters. Those stay the same. Change the symbol, and then flip all the slots. Is the outside activated? No, so we're going to turn it on. Left side activated? No, so we're going to turn it on. Right side activated? No, so we're going to turn it on. Bam. So saying A or B is the same thing as saying you can't have not A and not B. That one actually kind of makes sense. So this is saying you got to have one or the other, maybe both. That means the same thing as saying it's impossible for you to have both not A and not B, which is another way of saying you got to have one. You got to pick one. So that's what's going on here. We can have all different kinds of combos with this. I could say not A and not B. Use De Morgan's law on it. What do? Bring the letters down. Change the symbol. Okay, from dot to wedge. Right negation slot is on. We're going to turn it off. Left negation slot is on. We're going to turn it off. Outside negation slot is off. We're going to turn it on. And what is this? De Morgan's law, line 1. So is this one here over 2. So saying not A and not B is the same thing as saying you can't have a choice between A or B. Some of these are a little less obvious than others. Now, why would you want to do this? We'll see in a little bit in certain proofs. If you know this move, this will save you a ton of time. I'm going to do a problem in a little bit where you'll see that if you know that you can do this, sometimes this can save you hours of time. So know this move. And it's really this simple. The shorthand way to think of it is this way. If you want to go between a wedge and a dot, you can do that. Just change the slots. And the other rules are similar. They just have different slots to flip. We'll see that here in a moment. So in fact, the next one, let's take a look at material implication. In some ways, I think this one's even easier than De Morgan's law. It actually only works because De Morgan's law works. This is actually something else that we can get out of De Morgan's law. And whereas De Morgan's law allowed us to switch between dots and wedges just by changing the outside left and right negation slots, the way this works, material implication, you can switch between a wedge and an arrow and vice versa only by changing the left negation slot. So take a look at something like this. Let's say we've got a wedge B, and we want to turn it into an arrow. What do? Bring the letters down. So don't change them. Change the symbol. So we're changing wedge into an arrow. And then which negation slot do we change? Only one, the left one. So we don't need to worry about the right. We don't need to worry about the outside. We just change the left. And what is this? Material implication? Line 1. And this one is much more obvious, I think. So consider this statement. If A stands for clean your room and B stands for you're grounded, you can say this: clean your room or you're grounded. Which, through material implication, is the same thing as saying if you don't clean your room, then you're grounded. It's the exact same thing. It's just said in a different way. Putting De Morgan's law on line 1, we could also say, here's another way of putting it, change all the negation slots. So here this would say, it's impossible for it to be the case that you can not clean your room and not be grounded. That makes sense, but it's a sillier way of saying it. All three of these statements say the exact same thing, just in different ways. Kind of like how squiggle squiggle A and A are saying the same thing. It's not impossible is the same thing as saying something is possible. Similar stuff going on here. It's not merely double negation, but it's kind of the same thing. So saying clean your room or you're grounded, if you don't clean your room, then you're grounded, and it's impossible for you not to clean your room and not be grounded, are all really saying the same thing. Now when you're translating, translate it as it is. This third line here is just to show you that we could do that if we wanted to, which will actually come in handy for the next thing. But let's take a look at another version of this. Let's say we had squiggle, squiggle A, arrow, squiggle B. And I just said, hey, turn this into a wedge. We can do that, no problem. All you got to do, copy the letters down, change the symbol, and then only change the left negation slot. So the outside's going to stay, the right's going to stay, and the left side is on, so we're going to turn it off. So saying squiggle, squiggle A, arrow, squiggle B is the exact same thing as saying squiggle on the outside, A, wedge, squiggle B. That one's much less obvious, but that's how this works. All you got to do to switch between an arrow and a wedge is change the left negation slot. That's it. And actually, here a moment ago, I actually showed you what the third rule is. Let's take a look at what it is officially here now. All right, the third of these rules is conjunctive conditionality, and it works because the other two rules work. Okay, and it's actually just a shortcut that saves you doing an extra step with the other rules. And this is the way it works. Remember, De Morgan's law works this way. De Morgan's law is how to switch between a dot to a wedge and vice versa. And then material implication is how to switch between a wedge and a arrow and vice versa. Conjunctive conditionality is how to switch between a dot and an arrow and vice versa. So using these, you could do everything with just these two. This just ends up being a shortcut. Because if you wanted to switch from a dot to an arrow, you could switch it from a dot to a wedge, change it from a wedge into an arrow, and you're good. This is a move that just saves you a step. You can just go straight from one to the other. What do? So for De Morgan's law, which negation slots do you flip? The outside, the left, and the right. For material implication, which one do you flip? Just the left one. So for conjunctive conditionality, which ones do you flip? Just the outside and the right. That's it. So what that means is as straightforward as it sounds. Now, the results end up sounding a little wonky, I'll say that. You only have to use it if you start with something awkward, which sometimes people will do. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I say something like A dot B as an assumption, you can turn this into an arrow. How do you do it? Change the symbols, flip the outside and right negation slots. That's it. So bring the letters down, change the symbol, and all you do is flip the outside and the right negation slots. That's it. Is the outside negation slot on here? Nope. So we're going to turn it on, and that's going to activate a parenthesis. The left one we don't care about in this one, so I'm not even going to deal with it. The right side we do activate, so we turn this on. So A and B is actually the same thing as saying not A arrow, not B. That's conjunctive conditionality, line 1. Why would we ever want to use this? Let's say I said solve for squiggle Z arrow squiggle X. Your assumptions are Z and X. Go for it. And you might think, what can I do an arrow with? Well, no, you can't. Oh, you could do an indirect proof there. You could provisionally assume Z, arrow, squiggle X with your goal of getting a contradiction. So look, you could then get out X, and then you could put X and squiggle X together, and that's a contradiction proving that squiggle Z, arrow, squiggle X is a thing. What are we on there? Step 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, so that works. Or in this scenario, you could much more simply say, and in Z and X, and then line 4, you could just convert it. Look, you want to change this dot into an arrow? Look, change the outside, keep the left as it is, change the right side slot, conjunctive conditionality, line 3, you're done. No indirect proof needed. Now, you could have done it the indirect proof way, but this is what I mean by it saves you time. It saves you some steps. So these are moves that I've gone over, and if you can do these and you can make them habits, it's going to make the next batch of quizzes very, very easy. So, and actually all you need to know to do these 3 things that I just said is contained right in here. Let me make a little box around this. If you can memorize this, and yeah, I know this is an online class, it's asynchronous, and you're doing this stuff at home, but if you can memorize what I just drew in that box there, that's these 3 moves. Okay, you know De Morgan's law, you can switch from dots to wedges by changing all 3 slots. You can go from wedges to arrows by changing the left slot, and you can go from dots to arrows by changing the outside and the right slots. It's a cinch. In fact, you're going to have a quiz just on that. You could literally just have this on an index card or in your notes in front of you and get through that quiz. You don't really even have to think about it deeper than this. This is all you need to know for these moves. And these moves are going to make things very, very easy for you in the upcoming problems if you know to do them. So those were 3 more rules that we can use with disjunctions, namely De Morgan's law, material implication, and conjunctive conditionality. What I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to go into some problems from the book where we're going to work on disjunctions. See you next time.